It's Emily OFC Podfix. Flashpoint. Written by It's Emily OFC. Read by It's Emily OFC. Chapter 1. Tenzō had had about enough. It was one thing when they had a busy shift. While it wasn't how things were run at his last station, he could at least understand avoiding wearisome tasks like training exercises between hectic and harrowing call-outs. But on a day like today, they hadn't had so much as a kitten stuck in a tree, and despite the fact that there were only 3 weeks left to go in the calendar year and more than a dozen mandatory annual training exercises still incomplete, foosball appeared to be the activity of choice at Station 10. Tenzō had joined this station more than 2 months ago, but had yet to settle in properly. Maybe he had been naive to believe that a station was a station no matter where it was, because the crew he had been a part of back in Colorado couldn't have been more different from this one in Delaware. While he wouldn't have said he was exactly friends with his old crew, they at least had had an understanding, and under the iron-fisted rule of Captain Shimura, shit had gotten done. From what Tenzō had observed in the past 9 weeks at Station 10, though, nothing got done ever. The impending due date of annual trainings aside, Tenzō had to routinely work to find a single crewmate who knew how or was willing to hang up a hose or wipe down an engine. Even the probies stuck their noses up at the tasks that, really, they should have been responsible for in the first place. Tenzō had tried to be patient. He knew he wouldn't make any friends by coming into a new station and trying to boss others around. But now, sitting here, watching his crewmates shirk their responsibilities once again, he couldn't find it in himself to keep quiet any longer. Abizu, Tenzō started, as casually as he could. He was leant over the kitchen island directly across from his lieutenant, who was seated on a stool reading the local paper. Lieutenant Aburame, Abizu corrected without looking up from his paper. Tenzō resisted the urge to roll his eyes. As obsessed as this man was with his rank, Tenzō had never seen him once actually perform the duties associated with it. He was a thin man who was rarely seen without his small black sunglasses and never seen without his bandana. Tenzō suspected he was secretly bald and ashamed. Despite the fact that he'd done nothing Tenzō was aware of to earn the right to do so, Abizu walked around with an expression that indicated that he was perpetually unimpressed with those around him. Lieutenant Aburame, right. My apologies, sir. Tenzō tried again. Seeing as we haven't had any call-outs today, I was wondering if now might be a good time to complete one of our outstanding annual trainings. May I suggest the confined space training? Tenzō kept his tone light. He had the best chance of success if he gave the impression that he was sucking up to Abizu rather than telling him what to do. Abizu responded noncommittally. Tenzō waited for more, but was rewarded only with the rasp of a turning newspaper page. Meanwhile, a string of profanities could be heard from the high-stakes foosball game happening only 5 feet away. It's just, Tenzō continued, we only have 3 weeks left, and there are quite a few remaining. I know how many trainings there are left. 14, Abizu interrupted suddenly with a hiss as he laid the paper down flat on the counter. Tenzō blinked at the sudden change in demeanor. Of course you do, he placated, worried that he'd overstepped more than he had intended to. I'm sorry, sir. I'm sure you have a plan. Even as he said it, Tenzō doubted the veracity of his statement. It made no sense, though. If Abizu knew how far behind they were, why wasn't he doing anything about it? That's right, Abizu replied with a confident nod, though Tenzō thought he saw the man swallow nervously all the same. In fact, I was already planning on having the team get some training done today before you said anything. Tenzō doubted that very much, but was glad to hear it all the same. Abizu glanced quickly at the closed door to the captain's office. The captain was out today. He was out most days. It was a shame, really. While the man's personality wasn't what Tenzō would consider exactly captainly, the crew at least listened to him. Abizu, on the other hand, Tenzō's thoughts were interrupted by the loud and forced-sounding noise of his lieutenant clearing his throat. He was standing with his back to Tenzō now, facing the rest of their crew in the rec room. There was no discernible reaction. In fact, not only did no one look up from their respective activities, but Tenzō thought he saw Hayate slump a bit further down into the armchair he had nodded off in. The slight movement failed to disturb the precariously balanced array of objects the rookies Kotetsu and Izumo were stacking on top of his sleeping form as some sort of game. "Listen up!" Ebisu attempted a second time to gain the crew's attention, placing his hands on his hips authoritatively. "Shh!" Anko responded without looking up from the foosball table. "I'm trying to concentrate." Indeed, every ounce of her attention appeared to be focused on the small plastic sportsman she controlled. Ebisu's arms fell back to his side, fists curled in frustration, and Tenzō felt himself shrinking in a bit from second-hand embarrassment. The level of disrespect he had just witnessed would have been unfathomable at his last station. "We need," Ebisu started through clenched teeth. "Fuck yeah!" came Anko's interruption this time, just a split second after the distinctive clatter of a plastic soccer ball finding a home for itself in one of the foosball table's goal sockets. "Suck it, Sarutobi!" "Shit!" Asuma exclaimed, crossing his arms with a frown as Anko proceeded to perform a lewd celebration dance involving one of the handles on her side of the foosball table. He glared at the game table, as though it was somehow personally responsible for the fact that foosball wasn't the type of game that granted him an advantage for being larger and more muscular than his opponent. He was intimidating in form, Tenzō had to admit, but the effect of his size and musculature was diminished somewhat by his moody response to Anko's teasing. Tenzō was regretting goading Ebisu into action as he saw his lieutenant's fists begin to tremble in frustration. He was just about to try to suggest that they revisit the topic another time when the man finally snapped. "Enough!" Ebisu bellowed, and the room went silent for the briefest of moments before the consequences of Hayate's sudden wakefulness made themselves known, a cacophony of bangs, clatters, and thumps filling the air as all manner of books, markers, empty bottles, and coasters toppled to the floor. Before that disruption had ended, the room erupted in a combination of laughter and Hayate's persistent coughing, which combined were plenty loud enough to drown out Ebisu's final attempts to regain the group's attention. Tenzō watched with mounting anxiety as he stormed out of the room in defeat, the door slamming behind him. As the chuckles subsided, the attention in the room slowly shifted from the slammed door to Tenzō, frozen as he was behind the counter. "Now you've done it," Anko said, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes and fixing Tenzō with a sinister grin, not unlike what one might encounter on the Cheshire Cat. Anko might have been no taller than 5'3", but she was intimidating in her own way, with her unconventional purple hair and unmatched self-confidence. Tenzō felt sweat beating at his temple. He'd almost forgotten he was as much a part of the scene as anyone else, and not just a spectator. "Me?" he asked nervously, mind already racing with thoughts of how to distance himself from the situation. "Yeah, you," Asuma said with a chuckle, reaching into his pocket and producing his seemingly always present carton of cigarettes. He headed towards the door to the back lot, his own private designated smoking area. He turned his head just before departing, looking back at Tenzō with a cigarette already between his lips. "I'd steer clear of him for the rest of the day if I were you, new guy," he offered before disappearing through the door into the cold winter afternoon. Tenzō looked around the room incredulously. "You think he's mad at me?" he asked, not sure who he was directing the question to, but eyes finding Anko's. "Oh yeah, definitely," she affirmed, approaching him and hopping up to seat herself on the counter itself. "Ebisu hates being reminded that no one listens to him. Haven't you figured that out yet, new guy?" "But," Tenzō started, eyebrows knitting together in a confused sort of frustration, "we should be listening to him. He outranks us. and he was trying to get us to do one of the annual trainings that we need to do before the year ends, he argued, ignoring the fact that Anko really should know his name by now. So what? Anko shot back. If we don't get them done, it'll be him and Cap that get in trouble, not us. She reached for the fruit bowl beside her on the counter and plucked a few grapes out of it before continuing. Besides, it wasn't really Ibizu who wanted us to do training, was it? She popped a grape in her mouth, chewed and swallowed it. It was you. I heard you start it. Tenzō knew he was only digging a deeper hole for himself to climb out of by arguing with his crewmates like this, but he couldn't help the feeling of indignation rising up in him. And, he thought, it was really only Anko's already low opinion of him at stake. Asuma was still outside, presumably having a smoke. Hayate had fallen back asleep in his armchair, and Kotetsu and Izumo were whispering conspiratorially to one another, clearly in a world of their very own and oblivious to the conversation happening just a short distance away. But there's a reason we do annual training, Tenzō said, crossing his arms. Don't you want our crew to be good at what we do? He demanded. Oh, please, Anko said, wrinkling her nose. We don't need training for that. We know what we're doing. Just as she finished this assertion, Tenzō's attention was prized from the conversation at hand by the sound of a loud, dramatic gasp emanating from Izumo. He turned to assess the scene. Izumo's hands were covering his mouth and his eyes were wide in apparent terror. What? Kotetsu asked, panic evident in his voice. The two were crowded in front of Hayate's sleeping form, clearly up to no good. That's not a magic marker! That's a Sharpie, Kotetsu! He's going to kill you! Izumo hissed, stumbling backwards enough that Tenzō was able to see the dark, black, crudely drawn mustache with which they'd adorned Hayate's face. Shit! Kotetsu exclaimed, dropping the offending marker onto the floor. What do you mean, me? This was your idea! Well, Anko's defeated voice reached Tenzō's ears, but he continued to watch Kotetsu and Izumo's frantic quarreling anyhow. Most of us know what we're doing anyway. Before Tenzō could refute that statement, the door to the rec room burst open to reveal the large, unmistakable form of their captain. Hello! He bellowed, looking to be in good spirits to Tenzō, if his heroic pose was any indication. Yes, it's me, Jiraiya, your captain. No applause will be necessary. No one was clapping, came Anko's immediate, unimpressed response. I was going to, Kotetsu contended, earning him a look from Anko that Tenzō could clearly read as an accusation of brown nosery. Izumo was nodding in earnest, and the newly mustachioed Hayate was blinking dazedly, as if trying to determine which year it was. Of course you all were, Jiraiya agreed. Now, who are we missing? Where's Asuma? Right here, Asuma answered as he pushed his way through the back door. What brings you in today, Cap? He asked, as if the captain shouldn't always be at the station. Oh, good. Now that we're all here, I wanted to talk to you all about this department holiday party business, Jiraiya answered, suddenly having an air of seriousness about him. Tenzō wondered if he should mention that they were not, in fact, all there. Jiraiya's own second-in-command, Ibizu, was noticeably absent. He decided that he'd learned his lesson about speaking up for the time being, though. I want everyone on their best behavior, Jiraiya said, a warning tone in his voice. Let's not embarrass ourselves like we did last year. Anko erupted in a fit of cackles in response to this, and Asuma, too, released a few chuckles. Cap, Asuma said, making his way fully into the room and settling down onto a sofa. No disrespect, but the only person who embarrassed themselves at last year's holiday party was you. That sounded very disrespectful, as far as Tenzō was concerned, and he watched Jiraiya's face darken in annoyance. I didn't know she was a fellow captain. She looked too young. I thought she was a rookie, Jiraiya insisted in his defense. That makes it way worse, Asuma replied with a shake of his head. Tenzō didn't know the details of whatever event they were discussing from last year's holiday party, but he could already feel the last remaining dregs of his respect for his new captain draining away. "Whatever!" Jiraiya exclaimed, making his way over to the fridge, grabbing one of the beers that absolutely should not have been in there, and popping it open with his teeth. "My point is, everyone needs to watch themselves. Things are going to be changing around here in the new year, and it would be in your best interest to start out on a good foot. Got that, new guy?" Tenzō felt his eyes widen almost comically in incredulity. He was unmistakably the least likely to offend of anyone in the room. Whatever Jiraiya's explanation was going to be for the accusation, it was cut short by a sudden burst of coughs from Hayate. The man seemed to have a persistent illness of some kind. Tenzō wasn't one to pry, but he couldn't help but notice how often Hayate coughed, and this appeared to be a particularly aggressive and long-lasting bout. It was concerning. Tenzō rounded the corner and advanced towards Hayate, who was sitting up from where he had been doubled over during his coughing fit. He was already going over medical response protocols in his head and wondering why no one else was reacting when he noticed that the coughing fit had stopped just as quickly as it had started, and Hayate was staring at him, face completely void of expression. "Are you okay?" Tenzō asked, halting his advance only halfway across the room. "Yeah, why?" he asked blandly, making eye contact with Tenzō. Tenzō faltered. "Oh, you were..." He looked around the room to see his teammates staring at him in apparent confusion. Tenzō sighed. "Never mind," he said, retreating back to his spot behind the counter, feeling more comfortable with a physical barricade between himself and the rest of the crew. "Hey," Hayate said suddenly, turning to face Jiraiya. "Should Ibisu be here for this?" "Ah, shit," Jiraiya cursed under his breath. He tipped the beer bottle in his hand back and drained its contents in 3 large gulps before replying. "How about you just fill him in on what I said, okay?" Hayate nodded in agreement before coughing twice and glancing noticeably at Tenzō to see if he'd say anything. He didn't. "Perfect," Jiraiya said. "Great chat, everyone." He turned to leave then, but spun back around after just a few steps, eyes suddenly narrowed at Hayate. "What is it?" Hayate asked after 3 more coughs. Tenzō wondered if someone else was going to finally acknowledge the coughing. Jiraiya hummed a low tone, eyes narrowing almost to slits. He leaned forward a bit. "Captain?" Hayate asked, raising one eyebrow, leaning back against the chair as Jiraiya leaned forward. Jiraiya lifted a hand to his chin thoughtfully. "Did you always have a mustache?" It's Emily OFC Podfics.